Pop, Season 9, Episode 4. Hello and welcome to Pop, the mini podcast for busy teachers. My name is Laura, and joining me today to talk about a disruptive approach to teaching our materials is author Tyson Seburn. Tyson, in this episode, talks about what disruption means and how we can make our classes more inclusive by following the 5 steps that he refers to in his latest book, How to Write Inclusive Materials. Let's join the conversation where I asked Tyson, what does the disruptive approach mean?
A disruptive approach, and I use that for lack of a better term, is a little bit more focused on using the characteristics that are unique and the lived experiences to marginalized voices as part of the lesson, so that we're raising awareness with the students, or we're helping other students see themselves and their experiences in the materials as well. So that's kind of where a disruptive approach emerges from in comparison to a usualization approach. And then to be more specific or concrete, a disruptive approach, I give 5 situations that can help you build a disruptive approach lesson. I can give you those 5 right now if you'd like.
Yes, please. I think that will really help to cement what this looks like and how it's different from usualization.
First of all, you want to identify a social norm that is kind of unfair. It's either unfair to a bunch of marginalized groups or at least one group in some way, shape, or form. So I would suggest choosing a theme for a lesson that is something that the learners can experience in their daily lives in some way. It might be a belief, or it might be a behavior, it might be some social inequity, things like that. For example, one might be at a beach. So if you think of a beach situation, who has issues going to the beach, or who has barriers accessing the beach? Or if you think of a beach scenario, what type of group might not be able to enjoy the same things as other people at the beach? And I think one of those could be disabled people. People who are in wheelchairs might be a situation in that case. Another example might be people who have clothing restrictions according to their belief systems. So I remember there was a pretty well-known news story that was coming out of France at one point, where bikinis were fine in French areas on beaches, but the burkinis weren't actually fine.
I remember that,
yeah. They were banned. So that could be an example of an unfair situation that marginalizes a group of people. But you could also go with the wheelchair situation as well. That would be another one. Another example of a social norm that is a little bit more focused on queerness would be with regards to public washrooms. So when you think about all the different types of washrooms that are available at a restaurant or at an airport or in the school or any public place, and you think about what types of washrooms are available, there's quite often just a binary system of those washrooms. So we call those gendered washrooms. And so we could use that as a platform to start a lesson as well. And then once we have picked that social norm that causes this type of barrier, then what we want to do in a lesson is situate this social norm through visuals or texts, or those could be written or audio for the learners. And this gives kind of the learners, but also the teacher, a little bit of a baseline understanding of common experience, right? So do the learners think this is a barrier? Do the learners experience barriers themselves? Is there some kind of connection that a learner can make to this situation? So if we go kind of back to the 2 examples I gave initially, so the beach one, for example, we might ask learners to think about a typical beach or a pool culture, kind of like I did earlier with you, and ask about who you can see at a beach and what they're wearing. Maybe you'll show a picture of a typical beach scene in France with lots of bikinis and speedos, and you might not see any burkinis at all, right? And then you might ask them to decide if everyone would feel comfortable going to this beach and why or why not. So the point here is to bring in the sort of media that's going to situate this social norm and try to get the learners to generate a little bit about whether they sort of have even thought about whether there is a problem in this situation. So once you've had that sort of baseline of students talking about what they think, then it's important to actually have authentic input from people who are experiencing it themselves. So this is where you can bring in at least one text, whether that's an article or a story or a video or someone talking about the situation from their perspective. At least one of those, bring those in. So if it was about the beach, it would be important to bring in audio, for example, of a woman who feels uncomfortable at this beach. And she talks about her beliefs and her body and her exposure to needing to cover up, and maybe the perceptions of other people about judging her body. All sorts of things like this are important to bring in. So the students have actual exposure to the lived experiences of the people whom you're talking about. The next stage of disruption is then to try to get students to build personal connections to these experiences and these problems caused by the social norm, even if they aren't experiencing them themselves. So in that sort of situation, you want the students to think of scenarios perhaps that do impact them in a similar way to the way it's being impacting these people that they're not a part of the marginalized group with. So, if it was the beach situation and we were talking about burkinis and women who, from their faith, cannot wear a bikini at a beach, and therefore they don't go to the beach or something like that, then maybe people would be willing to talk about their own experiences about being judged at the beach in some way, shape, or form. It might, in this case, be an opportunity for students who have disabilities to say, I can't get into the water, right? So while I don't have exactly the same experience as this person we've been talking about, I have another experience that's kind of similar to this. I also experience a barrier. Let's try to solve these problems for both of us. I think in this fourth stage, you're kind of trying to get the students to build connections between the marginalized group and the issues that they have, and maybe yourself and your own experiences. So there's some empathy going on.
I was about to say that sounds like it's a really good kind of reflective exercise to get them to really, like say, connect. And empathy was the one thing that was coming to mind as you were describing that.
Agreed. I think empathy is probably, Kieran Donahue would probably agree with me here. One of the main reasons or ways in which you can solve quite a few problems, if people just think about how other people are experiencing the world, instead of feeling that they are only looking from their perspective all the time and cannot identify at all with these weird people, right? If they stop doing that and they build a little bit more empathy for each other, then a lot of these problems maybe not go away, but certainly we can work towards solutions rather than, just having fear or avoiding them.
Listening and empathizing, I think, would resolve a lot of challenges and open up space for communication to bring people closer together. You had another step I think you wanted to mention. So Can you just recap the 4 steps you've done to this point? Because we've covered lots of ground with the introduction of the idea to the empathy that you just mentioned. Would you mind just doing a quick recap before the final step?
Sure. So the first one is to identify a social norm that's unfair or it marginalizes at least one group of people. That's sort of on the teacher's end. Then the second is to situate that social norm for learners through visuals or texts and ask some critical questions to establish a baseline of understanding with the students about it. The third one is then to bring in the authentic, real, marginalized individuals' experiences of this social norm so that it provides insight to how it actually marginalizes rather than just guesswork. The fourth then is to ask students to build personal connections to these problems that are caused by the social norm by either bringing in their own experiences of something quite similar to that, or even something that is marginally similar to it, and to build some empathy between one group and another group of students. And then the last one is to really work on solutions, right? So to improve the situation through some sort of activity. And that would be the one where you're practicing the language, obviously, that you've been targeting throughout this as we as we said, don't forget the language component. But in this case, it might be tasking the learners with coming up with beach rules or etiquette, in that first situation, something that's going to make a beach better for all members of society, not only you or the marginalized group perhaps that you're talking about, but they could be related to clothing or pets or smoking or wheelchairs or anything like that. Maybe in the washroom situation, you ask students to think about, okay, well, how could we change the existing spaces we have in public areas to make it work for all types of people trying to go to the washroom. I went to some restaurants around here in Toronto recently, and there's quite a few now that are completely genderless. There's a common area where you walk in to wash your hands, and then there are like stalls with no indication of who can go into them. It's just sort of anybody, but they're completely closed, right? It's not like you can sort of see under or anything like that. So there's, that's an example of a solution that has worked in some cases for this situation. And maybe they went through this type of lesson to come up to that. Who knows?
Yeah, maybe that's what inspired the whole design. You never know, because architects and designers are usually in those kind of bouncing idea stages around tables, and that's how they come up with these solutions. So why can't we just bring that kind of practice into the classroom itself?
Exactly. And you never know who's in the classroom anyway, because your students, if they're adults, might actually be architects or people in situations like this. So, you never know what you're going to teach or what students are going to take away from these situations. And I think we've kind of all learned that over time, right?
Yeah. Tyson, it's been lovely talking to you today. Thank you so much for talking about this disruptive approach and unpacking these 5 steps in how you can bring it into the classroom. To close today's episode, could you please share where can listeners find out more about your book and read more about this to apply it to their teaching context?
So I talk about it quite a bit. I think if you're on social media, you can follow me at Seburn. I'm pretty much that everywhere. But on this sort of inclusive practices topic, there's a pretty unique hashtag. I don't know if you've seen it or not, but it's #HowToInclusive. And it kind of bucks the trend of grammatically correct sort of hashtags. And so it's quite noticeable and memorable, I think. So it's #HowToInclusive. That's going to bring up a lot of posts, I think. And I'm one of the only people that uses it, so it's pretty easy to find it. But it stems from my book, as you can see, How to Write Inclusive Materials. When I first wrote this book, when it was first published, and I was starting to promote it, I thought, okay, I need a hashtag of some sort to make it simple to remember. And so I played around a little bit with it, but it just came from the title, right? How to, and then inclusive. And if you write the whole book title, it's just ridiculously long. So this was just a happy coincidence that it not only sort of makes it easy to remember because it's so odd, but it's also easy to remember because it's the title of the book.
Fantastic. As always, I've included those links, including the link to Tyson's book, in the show notes so you can find them easily. So click there to find out more. If you have a question or an idea that you'd like to pitch for the podcast, you can contact us via Facebook, Instagram, or the website tsopop.com. Finally, you can support the work we do by leaving a rating review for this episode, or by sharing today's episode with your teaching community, or by even buying us a coffee at ko-fi.com/tsopop.